Thanks again for joining us today, folks. Really excited about this webinar. I think we're all going to learn a lot about 3D printing and how it's being used in radiation therapy today. I didn't want to take too much of Brian's time, but since I do have the floor, I am definitely going to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about Adaptiiv and what our software solution can do for cancer treatment and for your treatment center and facility itself. So yeah, let's move on. And if you have any issues with audio or technical, please let us know in the chat, and we'll get to you there. So yeah, as I mentioned, a little bit about Adaptiiv. We're an advanced in-house 3D printing software solution for use in radiation therapy. So there are some other options out there where you can have mail order software or third-party fabrication of these accessories for use, but our solution is an in-house platform where a treatment center can actually have the software that fully integrates with their existing workflows and TPS, and as well as 3D print and create the physical device, the physical medical accessories right there on the spot. So yeah, our solutions used in photon and electron radiotherapy, as well as high dose rate surface brachytherapy. You know, a lot of you may already know this because you've been following us diligently. I know you have been, and paying attention to what we've been doing in the market. But for those that don't, you know, our solution designs and creates patient-specific medical accessories for use in radiation therapy. So we're taking, you know, patient-specific CT imaging and scans and using that with centers' existing treatment planning systems and workflows to create these patient-specific and custom medical accessories that are used during radiation therapy. In terms of regulation and being regulatory cleared, we are really one of a kind in the market. As of July of last year, we received our FDA 510K clearance, and we're the world's first company with that FDA clearance to market our software, a 3D printing software solution that's intended for use in radiation oncology. So really special designation there. We're very proud of having achieved that. We did it in a very short time frame last year, we were told record time. Nonetheless, it's a feather in our hat that we really are proud of. And we also have regulatory clearance in Australia, as you see, and in Europe with our CE mark. I will mention that we're ISO certified as well. So in terms of regulatory clearance, we're pretty covered. The last point here on validation and verification is important. So Brian will allude to this later on in the presentation, but we wanted to take as much of the learning curve and legwork out of it for the users as much as possible. So we spent upwards of over 3,000 hours, or probably nearing in on 4,000 hours now of time spent validating a 3D printer. So you'll see there on the right, the Axiom 20 is what we use, which is made by Airwolf 3D out of California. And we have spent, as you see, a lot of time validating that printer for use with our software, as well as filament materials to use with the printer as well. One would be a PLA, like a polylactic acid, which is a rigid, inflexible filament material. And we're working on validating and verifying flexible filaments such as thermoplastic polyurethane. We just recently completed validation on Cheetah, which is produced by NinjaFlex, which is a TPU filament. So very proud of that as well. Moving on to some of the features and advantages of our solution, I mentioned the seamless integration. So we fully integrate with your center's existing TPS, with the majority of TPSs out there, as well as your existing radiotherapy workflows. Again, trying to take as much of the pain out of introducing a new software into a treatment center. We integrate fully and seamlessly with your existing system. So you can ensure that efficiency is at a maximum when you're using our software platform. We also, our solution optimizes the fabrication process. So there's significant savings in time to fabricate these accessories. We're also eliminating the need for complex wax bolus, like such as superflab, that is very difficult to produce and work with. You know, we've seen some cases that are reducing fabrication time from 30 to 40% in the majority of cases. We've seen one scalp case that took 30 hours to produce the bolus traditionally, and it took 2 minutes in our software. So that is a huge time savings, which allows you know, speed. If you need to change during course of treatment, change a bolus. If the patient's anatomy changes, you're able to reproduce something very quickly. And as well as it frees up your staff so they can, you know, see and treat more patients or devote their resources where they're needed. Another cool feature of our software is in vivo dissymmetry. So that's built in into our software. So you're able to automatically print these pockets within a bolus or applicator, which allows you to measure dose accurately. Some post-processing tools that we've recently introduced with version 2.0 of our software. So cleaving's a huge function that we've added, and Brian again will allude to this later and add on to what I'm saying, but our cleaving function allows users to cleave a bolus or applicator into 2 parts at any angle. Comes into very valuable when you're dealing with complex parts of the anatomy, such as a scalp or a nose, you know, that isn't flat or yeah, like a chest wall. Cropping and smoothing, and again, Brian will talk about patient ID labeling. Those are all features that are included in our software. The design is a big benefit that we help in our software solution helps with. As it talks about on the slide here, we're able to tailor dose distribution and that fit. So I talked about custom patient-specific fit. You're able to maintain that fit throughout the course of treatment by using our software. As we'll see on the next couple slides, some of our modules also improve the sparing of healthy tissues. So you're reducing the dose to these normal underlying tissues and organs at risk, and really focusing dose on the PTB and where it's needed. Our modulated electron bolus lowers the presence of hot spots, providing a homogeneous dose distribution. Again, you'll see a visual depiction of this in the next slide, and a video example as well. And above all, improved patient care and comfort is of utmost importance to us. The patient experience when they're dealing with such a life-changing diagnosis of cancer is, as you can imagine, so important. And we at Adaptiiv aim to provide the highest standard of patient care all across the world. So again, with our customers, our current customers and collaborators, we're able to provide that. And hopefully you are intrigued enough to learn more, and you can ask some questions throughout this presentation on anything you so choose about our software. So like I mentioned, there are some visual depictions here of our software at work. On the left, our uniform thickness bolus kind of just shows the reduction in air gaps that is achieved when you're using this patient-specific fit and custom bolus. You know, the dose accuracy, as you can imagine, is much greater and much improved without those air gaps. So you can see in the picture here on the left, you have your traditional sheet bolus, such as superflab, that doesn't conform as well as it should, or you'd want it to a patient's anatomy. And then you have our 3D printed bolus, which you can see reduces those air gaps and improves that dose accuracy. On the previous slide, I did mention our modulated electron bolus and reducing those hot spots and providing a more homogeneous dose distribution. On the right here, actually, you can see that there's dose wash occurring here with a conventional bolus, and you get those organs at risk, OARs, and underlying healthy tissues being exposed to radiation. By using our solution and our modulated electron bolus module, you're able to tailor that dose distribution and prevent the radiation to those underlying healthy tissues. Yeah, and that's achieved through, you know, our advanced software solution, very simple and easy to use. Like I mentioned again, there's a video evidence here of how that works. So again, in our MEB module, we modulate the electron beam so you can achieve conformity of the radiation dose. So you can see in the top there, I'll actually pause this, I'll go back and play this again. The standard bolus, it covers a PTV, but a non-conformal high dose region is produced, as you see there in the highlighted red, causing overexposure to underlying tissue. Now with our MEB module, you can see that conforms to the PTV, and the modulated fluence improves sparing of those healthy tissues. So very important to note that, and a key advantage of our software. Moving on here, our high dose rate surface brachytherapy module is used to treat various types of surface skin cancer or lesions. Again, very easy to use. The point-and-click software enables users to create customizable catheter tunnels and trajectories specific to the patient again. So you'll hear, and as Brian talks about throughout his presentation, personalized medicine is becoming the norm and the standard of care in medicine these days, today. And, we're very fortunate that our software allows for that. The brachytherapy module is very cost effective. As you can imagine, and those who have experience with creating brachytherapy applicators by hand or traditionally, a lot of material used, a lot of time is consumed. So we eliminate the need and of course, a lot of money that goes along with both of those things. So as you improve those efficiencies, the quality of the product actually improves too. Conformal fit is, again, better comfort for the patient. Again, version 2.0, we just enhanced the catheter tunnel algorithm, so it improves the way the tunnels are generated. An important part to note is that you can actually import your applicator design back into the TPS to conduct dose recalculations. So that's very valuable that we've heard in feedback. So we may be having technical difficulties here. But this just shows our software at work. This video here doesn't seem to be playing on our screen, but yeah, it is. Okay. So yeah, and that shows how you can generate the catheter tunnels and modify them based on how you want dose to be delivered. Simple point and click. And yeah, you can import that back into your TPS to conduct dose recalculations. Lastly, I will, the last couple slides here, we're now in 9 countries, so we have customers and collaborators all over the world. As you see here, I'm proud to announce that in the past week, we expanded to our 9th country in Mexico, so very pleased about that, and I'm sure there'll be more to come, so we're very looking forward to a lot of great activity this year. And just some recent updates. So I talked about our some of our recent customers that we signed. Here's a list of them. Again, Indiana University being one of them, as Brian will be presenting today from our customer there, who collaborates as well with us. And important to note is that without the tremendous partnerships and relationships we have with our customers and collaborators, we wouldn't be able to make improvements to our software and our solution. And the feedback that we get and we hear from customers is just not short of anything spectacular to help us out. So we're very fortunate that we have these relationships with the collaborators. They help us with new modules and bringing new products to market. We're excited to be working on some things right now. We can't announce right away, but look forward to a few new modules and product announcements that we have on our roadmap for this year. Again, without our collaborators and customers, we wouldn't be able to do that. One of our first customer, actually, our flagship customer, the Nova Scotia Health Authority here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where we're based, is just across the street. And actually, they're our prime research partner. So when we're testing and going through this validation, as I mentioned before, on printers and filaments, we use their facility to conduct clinical testing. So we're able to have a direct correlation to patients through Nova Scotia Health Authority. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say and mention their name. Our inventor of our software, Dr. James Robar, is the chief of medical physics over there. So him and his team are invaluable to our research Obviously, Dr. Robar is a brilliant man for what he does in the medical physics field, and what he's done with our software is nothing short of amazing. So very, again, fortunate to have people like Dr. Robar associated with our product. Just recently, we announced a strategic partnership with Eckert & Ziegler out of Germany. That's very, very big for us. That partnership sees the alignment of our systems for brachytherapy radiation treatment. So Eckert & Ziegler, BBIG, is a leader in brachytherapy radiation treatment. And again, very fortunate to be able to collaborate and work with them on improving patient treatment all throughout the world. Filament validation, as I mentioned, the Cheetah TPU, the thermoplastic polyurethane, flexible filament, just recently completed validation, and we're working on validation of multiple filaments right now. So stay tuned for announcements on that. We'll be sure to let you know. Just recently in Milan at Estro 38 in Italy last month, just a couple weeks ago, one of our medical physicists here, Borko Basaric, was able to present an e-poster on what I talked about earlier, the hotspot corrections in our modulated electron radiation therapy module. So that actually, we're proud to say, is patent pending, that algorithm. And Borko was able to present on that at Estro to, you know, great feedback from folks at the show there. Lots of questions, lots of follow-up. So very pleased about that research and what Borko and the team here actually have undertaken and achieved. If you have any questions about any of this, please let me know. My contact information will be available at the end of the presentation. And this week, actually, we are releasing the latest version of our software 2.1, which includes some enhancements and performance improvements, to name a few, as well as the alignment with Eckert & Ziegler's systems. So that's all the time I'll take of yours today. Very pleased, and I will not do him justice, the right justice that he deserves, but Brian Overshiner, we are so fortunate for him to be able to join us today. He has close to 20 years of experience as a radiation therapist, and the last 5 years he has spent, you know, working with 3D printers and working with 3D printing in general, whether it's for his own personal fun and entertainment or in a clinical setting at Indiana University. So I will now pass the mic over to Brian and allow him to present and maybe give a little bit of an overview of himself. So Brian, you there?
Yes, you guys hear me okay?
You're perfectly fine. Yeah.
All right, let me share my screen here with you guys. You guys all see that okay? All right. Well, thank you.
Not coming in yet.
All right, thank you, Rohit, for that nice introduction. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to work with a great company like Adaptiiv. I met Peter Hickey, the CEO of Adaptiiv, several years ago at Astro, and just have always been impressed with the quality of people they have working for them. And like I said, it's just it's an honor for me to be able to collaborate with you guys. And as Rohit mentioned, close to I just had today, ironically, is my 19th year as a radiation therapist here at IU. I was a staff radiation therapist for many years, transitioned into running our CT simulator, where I obviously scanned and planned all the patients. Also started to fabricate one-off treatment devices here and there. About 2014, I started just as a personal hobby getting into 3D printing, and slowly realized how many useful applications 3D printing had in the medical field, and specifically radiation. So slowly started kind of learning the ropes. I'm all self-taught, a lot of online courses, a lot of YouTube videos, and a lot of people that help me out on campus here. So one of those people is actually sitting beside me today. I have my lead 3D Innovations Lab tech here, Tim Nissy. So you may hear his name or his voice pop up here and there. But
sorry, Brian, just to interrupt, this is Rohit again.
yes,
We can't see your screen, so would you mind trying to share that again?
yeah, no problem.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Let's see, try. Give me 1 second here. There we go. How's that?
Perfect.
You guys see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Sorry about that. All right, well, enough about myself. Let's get on the stuff that you guys are interested in. I know there's probably a wide range of people out there listening today that all different levels. I'll try not to get too technical with everything. We'll kind of keep it generalized because I know a lot of people are interested in just kind of learning about the 3D printing process and how we print bolus. I get that question a lot. I'll get a phone call from someone who's like, "Hey, how do I print a bolus?" And then I kind of chuckle to myself. That's a long answered question, but in a nutshell, you're going to have to basically take your bolus structure out of your planning software, and we're going to need to put it into the Adaptiiv software where we can then create that 3D object, and then that object then we can take to the 3D printer and print. So I'll get into more in depth about each of these steps here in a little bit, and as Rohit kind of already very well described their software, how easy it is and integrated it is into your everyday workflow. So we'll go over those steps a little bit more in detail here. Another question I get commonly is, hey, Brian, I want to get into 3D printing bolus. What printer should I buy? And again, that's a hard question to answer. Everyone's going to have a little bit different, needs or wants or budgets. Here in the United States, we have to be very careful with regulations, FDA specifically. And what's nice about Adaptiiv and about all the validation that they've done, they went through all the hard work and validated their software and the Axiom printer. So for those of us in the States whose organizations may be, and I'm speaking from my own experience, very concerned with what type of materials we're putting on our patients, our processes that we're using to make these medical accessories. We want to make sure that we do it safe and we provide a lot of, a good high quality product. So there's many different types of printers though out there, and basically they all function roughly the same way. We're going to be talking specifically about FDM type printers, or sometimes called FFF type printers. And what those are, basically they work by taking a material, which is we call filament, and basically it's a wire that was melted through a hot end or a print head onto a build plate. So there's some basic anatomy, as you can see on the screen there, of an FDM type printer. And what that stands for, and you'll hear these terms used a lot: fused deposition modeling or fused filament fabrication. That basically consists of that that wire filament being melted and extruded onto that build platform. That print head will move around in 3 directions, X, Y, and Z axis, and that's done with little motors. The print head will then, lay down one melted layer of filament each time, and kind of, if you can think of it maybe as stacking pancakes on top of each other, or a loaf of bread, one layer on top of another, and it'll just kind of build your object that way. Some of the other terminology that what we're going to be throwing around today, and you may hear as you start your own quest in 3D printing and learning 3D printing, one of the most common ones is STL. I'll tell Tim all the time, hey, give me the STL. And what that means is it's just basically the file format that 3D printers or other CAD softwares like to use to print their objects with. It basically describes the surface geometry of an object. It stands for stereolithography. So when we talk STLs, we're just talking about the actual volume of an object most times. Another term you'll hear is slicer. I'll say, hey, go ahead and slice that model, Tim. And that basically means we're going to take our 3D model, whichever it is, if it's a bolus or a brachytherapy applicator, and we're going to put it into the software for the printer to basically slice it into those individual layers and give the machine the XYZ coordinates to lay down that material. G-code is another one. G-code is the programming language that printers and other CAD-based machines understand. That all that is just compromised of numerical control values. So it tells the printer, move 2 millimeters to the left, go up 1 millimeter. It's just kind of a value system to move the printer head around. When we talk about mesh, it's similar. We kind of use mesh and STL sometimes together, even though they are different. Mesh is just kind of what you're seeing on the screen to your left. It's made up of polygons. So it's that object. Density of our object. So most of the time when we're going to print a bolus, we're going to use 100% infill. If you're printing another object, you may not need to make it 100% solid. You may want to make it hollow, for example. So you can change the amount of infill in your object. And then the last one here is support. When we talk about support of an object, we're talking about when we print that object, we may need to put additional material on the print bed that's going to hold our object in the orientation to best be able to print it. One thing that I always tell people when they're getting started, they've bought a printer, they have their software, they kind of got a little experience under their belt. We approach it, here at IU, and me personally, I've always approached making bolus just like I would any other device. So when we talk about setting up your printer, it's really important to calibrate and maintain your printer, just as you would, as if you're a physicist, calibrate your LINAC or any other, your afterloader, for example. You approach it with that same mindset. This is a tool that we use to print patient-specific medical devices. So we want to make sure that we have the utmost highest quality when we do that. You're going to want to make sure that the temperature, for example, is correct for the material you're using. Your bed is completely leveled. You want to make sure that when you start printing, you have a great first layer that's going to adhere to the bed so your print doesn't fail. You want to make sure that you take care of your filament. It's very susceptible to absorbing moisture, so when you're not using it, you want to unload it from your machine and store it properly. These may not seem like very important things on the surface, but when you're trying to print a really difficult shape, in my opinion, why start behind the 8-ball, for example? Make sure your printer is up to snuff and printing the best quality you can. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And Tim has something to add on that here.
Yeah, for proper calibration, it's super important, especially when you're printing bolus, for it to be accurate, the dimensions to be accurate. So making sure that if you're going to print a 20 millimeter cube, that all the sides are 20 millimeters. And that's just, you got to go every month and calibrate it and do some stuff for that.
Yep. So we'll get into a little bit more in depth of the workflow for the bolus. And like as Rohit mentioned earlier in the presentation about how Adaptiiv seamlessly integrates to your treatment planning software, that's really important. Without Adaptiiv Software, to be able to create a bolus like this and print it, you're going to be using multiple different softwares. You're going to have to convert DICOM into a structure. Early on in my career, when I started trying to make these boluses without Adaptiiv, I found lots of problems with over-the-counter software that it didn't reconstruct the shapes correctly. And that can lead to serious errors. So it's real important to use a quality software like Adaptiiv. They make it so easy that you can export the bolus structure out of the treatment planning software, convert that structure into the 3D object, and then, if you're doing a modulated bolus and you want to correct for those hot spots that may occur, you can seamlessly transmit that structure back into your treatment planning software, rerun your plan, make any adjustments you need to before you go and print that. What's nice about the Adaptiiv software, it will convert that DICOM data into that 3D structure for you as well, as I mentioned. And it does all that in preparation for you to take it out of Adaptiiv into your printing software. This is just a kind of a screenshot. I know that Rohit kind of already showed a little bit of this, but I just wanted to show this in the presentation just for familiarity's sake. You know, this looks very similar to what you may be working with in Eclipse, for example, or any other TPS. You can see the body contours are all there. You can see the bolus structure is there as well. You'll notice up in the right when you select the bolus structure, and I'm going to use my mouse here on the screen so you guys can kind of get an idea what I'm talking about here, but you can select the structure here. So right now I have selected the bolus, 1 centimeter bolus structure here, and so you'll see that structure come into view here in the upper right. And what's really nice about this software, it's going to save you so much time. They have their own auto smoothing algorithm, which will go ahead and smooth the surface of this bolus for you. This is a really great feature. And as some of you may know, when you convert DICOM data into a 3D object, just given the inherent resolution of your TPS when you create an object in that, can be very stair-stepped or very jagged looking. So early on when we started printing bolus, we could see that stair-stepping on our phantom testing and things, and we were really concerned with that because it can leave little micro air gaps everywhere. So having this smoothing feature is a really huge thing. It makes it really nice for these boluses to fit the patients very well. This is just kind of a close-up on that bolus section here in the software. And a couple things I want to point out real quick also is, you know, we're doing personalized medicine here. These are individually made to the patient's specifications. They have a really great ID tag that you can put on these bolus. So for example, a lot of times we'll print multiple bolus on the same build plate. So we may run our printer overnight, print maybe 3 or 4 patients. You know, for printing 2 or 3 chest walls, you want to be able to identify these. So having the ID tag is a really nice thing to do. A lot of times I'll put the ID tag on the superior, you know, left corner, for example. That way my therapist, when they go to place it on the patient, they know, okay, this is upper left. I know how this is going to orientate. So sometimes it's hard to tell. The other nice features that you have here that Rohit mentioned as well are the cleaving and cropping features. So when we go to print this bolus, we want it to adhere to the bed, and we want it to be a flat surface. So you can actually crop the bottom or cleave the bottom off of the bolus so that there's a nice flat surface you can see on the bottom here that will actually adhere to the bed. So that's a really nice feature. Allows you to do all of this in one software, which is also really nice. So when we talk about Slicer, and that's where I mentioned earlier, this is the program that's going to slice your model so your printer can go and print this. And a lot of people are like, what do you mean? I have to have another software? Are you kidding me? Like, so it's not as bad as you think. They're really easy to use. Most of your printers that you're going to purchase will come with their version or their flavor of slicing software. We primarily here use the Apex. That is the version of the version slicer that comes with the Axiom 20 printers. It's actually based off of the Cura slicing engine. So if you use another form of Cura, you're getting that same background engine that's going to slice these. You can actually set up different slicing softwares to work with your individual printers. It's maybe just a matter of putting your printer's dimensions into the slicing software. I won't get too technical into that, but it is possible if you have a particular slicing software that you're used to or like, you can set another printer up for that.
A good way to explain what the slicing software does is that it's basically the object. There's an endpoint. Think about it like Google Maps. The extruder is extruding out the plastic in a very specified way, and it's giving it a route. That's all it is. It's taking your object and turning it into a route that the 3D printer can understand.
So when you go into your slicer, let's say you've exported your bolus and you're ready to print, and you have your bolus sitting on your print bed. I wanted just to kind of go through some of the settings that you may want to get familiar with when you're first starting out. And when you open up your slicing software, you're going to see all sorts of settings. Especially if you hit the advanced tab, you're going to get hundreds, literally, of numbers and things. And a lot of these you can probably ignore when you get started. I've kind of highlighted the ones that are going to be most useful to you when you're just getting started here. So some of those are going to be the layer height, the fill density, the print temperature, your bed temperature, and then your support. So we're going to go through a couple in depth, a couple of these here, just to kind of get you guys started. So when we talk about the layer height, that is key when we're printing these boluses that are, let's say for a very curved chest wall or a scalp, for example. You can think of layer height as kind of like a resolution almost. So if we use a very low or thin layer height, you're going to get more detail. A taller or thicker layer height is going to give you less detail. The parts will look more of like kind of that stair step, as I mentioned earlier. A lot of times in your slicing software, your layer height will be displayed as a numerical value, but not always. Some slicing softwares will put a word value on it. So they may say like fine detail or draft quality or extra fine. You will have a number that you can always type in there if you so desire. But that's what layer height kind of means. You can see in the diagram here how the difference between having fine detail and coarse detail is what that looks like. I have a little diagram here that's kind of show you when we talk about layer height, and I'm trying not to get too technical here for those beginners, but when we have a angle, let's say this 45-degree angle here on the screen, and we're printing at 500 micron or 0.5 millimeter layer height, you can see it does a really nice job of overlapping each successful layer here. And this overlapping here is what's going to make a really nice watertight, solid model without any gaps in it. But you can see if we keep those same settings, we go over here to a 60-degree angle. So this is where your model may start to curve. The printer's going to try to compensate for that. And you can see now we don't have as much overlap on the individual layers here. And this is where I start to get a little nervous and where you can start to run into some problems with layer adhesion. You don't have as much surface area bonding the two layers together. You can start to get cracks or holes in your model. So that's where, when you start to get in these severe angles where you may want to start to think about adjusting your layer height. So here's a picture of that same 60-degree angle. And you'll notice that I changed my layer height now. Instead of 0.5, we're at 0.25. So what that's going to do is actually increase the number of layers. But you can see here, what it actually did is still maintains that 50% overlap. So just by changing the layer height and no other settings, we're going to get a better print quality here because that model now is going to have a lot more surface area to adhere itself to, and it's going to print those curves really nicely. Decreasing your layer height, I want to mention, when you do that, because people will say, well, why not just print the entire model with, the lowest layer height possible? And you definitely could do that, and it'll be a really nice looking model. But you have to keep in mind that's going to increase the overall number of layers that printer is going to have to print. So that's going to increase the overall print time. So, for example, if you have a object that's not very curved, and maybe it makes more sense to print that at a thicker layer height because that's going to save you a lot of time. My general rule is I try to get away with printing at the thickest layer height I can while maintaining good quality in those curvatures. And once you guys get better at understanding your slicer and spending more time into it, there is a way that you can actually, this is the pro tip I'll say, is you can actually vary the layer height within the object. So for those areas of the object that aren't as curved, you can set the slicer to slice that area a little bit thicker. So it'll take less time to print that area. And then once you have an area with overhangs that you're concerned with, you can set that particular section to print at a lower layer height, so you'll know that that will print successfully. So it's just a nice way, a little trick way to still get that really good quality, and you're going to be saving a lot of time on the printer. One of the most important things, if not the most important thing when you're printing, not only Bolus but anything in general, is build plate adhesion. So this is where we want to talk about how that model is going to stick to the build plate. The worst thing you can do is not, or worst thing you can have happen is you have, let's say, a 6-hour print, and you walk away from your printer, it's 4 hours in, everything looks great. You come back in the morning and the thing's toppled over because it became unhooked from the print bed, and now you got to start over.
The printer doesn't know that it messed up, so it keeps on going.
The printer will keep printing. You will be left with a big ball of extruded filament. It's happened to everybody. It even happens to the best of us. But there are certain things you can do, which I'm going to share with you to try to eliminate that. The two most common settings in your slicer for build plate adhesion are going to be a raft and a brim. There are others, but for printing Bolus, these are the two primary ones I use. You can see the difference here on the left. This is a raft, and what a raft is basically, it lays down this material anywhere from 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters thick, and your model is going to actually sit on top of that raft. It's going to be bonded to that. Now you can break the raft off pretty easily after the model is already printed, but all your support and all your model will be sitting on top of this. This is going to give you the most surface area for adhering to the bed. So if you're having bed adhesion problems when you're printing, I suggest switching over to a raft, maybe increasing the size of the raft to give you that more surface area to bond. The other one that I use typically is a brim, and much like a raft, you can see how it puts kind of a, I guess the best way to describe it is as a little skirt almost of material around the model. It's actually connected to the model, and this will kind of increase the surface area where the model is touching the build surface. It also does that for the support as well. So you make sure, the last thing you don't want also is your support breaking off. If your support is actually holding your model in place, if that comes loose, then that can lead to problems with your model coming loose as well. A couple other tricks that we use in our lab here, depending on the surface that you're printing on. Some printers, for example, the Axiom has a glass bed, so we're printing straight directly on glass. So we can put either a glue stick or some hairspray onto the bed. That just creates a little bit of a tacky surface for the melted filament to adhere to. It's not going to be so much where you can't get the model off of the bed after it's done, but it's just a little tack to be able to make sure that that print is adhered to the bed.
And a super pro tip is Aquanet hairspray.
Aquanet hairspray works great. It's super cheap too. It's literally like $2 US for a big can. It'll last you forever. Infill, when we talk about infill, everyone's like, what does that mean? That is the material that's going to be inside of your object or your bolus. You can set different infill patterns, different infill percentages. Typically when we print a bolus, we're always going to be printing 100% infill. We want that completely solid object. If you're going to be printing one of Adaptiiv's brachytherapy applicators, for example, there are certain instances where you may not need that to be 100% filled. You can use your own particular amount of infill based on your calculations or your comfort with those. So your slicer will have a setting for that. You're always going to want to make sure if you're printing a bolus to make sure, like I said, put in 100% in there. Keep in mind, a solid object is going to take more time to print. For example, if you're printing a mold or a shell, you're going to have 0% infill. It's going to print a lot faster than a solid object. So just keep that in mind, your print time. The other thing you always want to check if you're printing a solid bolus is to make sure you don't have any gaps or air pockets within the bolus. You want to check the homogeneity of that. My suggestion is print a couple test objects, print a test bolus, cut the thing in half or stop it midway, look at your infill. So you can see in this picture here, it almost looks like, these lines aren't quite touching. And that just may be your slicer rendering that. So you want to check your actual print. If you notice that some of these infill lines are not touching itself, you can adjust for that in the slicing software. You can have those lines printed a little bit thicker. You can have a overlap. You can tell it a percentage to overlap those lines to make sure that you get a nice solid object. So I would say second to build plate adhesion is temperature. Even if you have that model stuck to your build plate really well, if you don't have the correct temperature for the material you're using, you're going to get bad print quality. You can see in this picture here, this is a calibration file that you can find online. There's lots of them out there to where you can print at different temperatures and kind of see how your printer operates and with what material. Those are the two common things that you're going to want to change is your print temperature and your build plate temperature. And not only your printing temperature, but also I always want to mention the ambient temperature of your printer. I work down in a basement of a hospital. It's cool down here. It's the humidity is maybe a little higher than in other areas of the hospital. And believe it or not, if you have an open printer, that can affect your print quality. What's nice about the Axiom printer, which I love it so much, it's an enclosed system. So it keeps a nice ambient temperature within the print volume. So it eliminates some of those, cool, breezes that might flow over the print bed and so forth that may affect your print quality. If you're having adhesion problems, generally speaking, you may want to try to adjust your bed temperature a little bit. 60 degrees is pretty standard for PLA. I've printed down to 45 before with success. Matter of fact, some of my printers that print PLA don't even have a heated bed at all. My suggestion always is when you start adjusting temperature is do one at a time. If you start changing too many things at once, you won't really understand or have an idea of what worked. So maybe change your build plate temperature by 5 degrees and try again. Try your test print with that and see if you get a good adhesion. So I always change by 5 degrees and then just reattempt the print. You also have to adjust the temperature for different materials. Most of the time when we print solid bolus, we're using PLA. But there may be cases where you may use a different material, for example, like PETG or ABS. Those materials are going to print at different temperatures. So you're going to want to make sure you remember to change those temperatures if you switch materials. And make sure you maintain a consistent profile. You can save all of those settings for each material. What you don't want to do is get into the habit of changing materials. Let's say you're printing bolus one day and the next day you're printing something different. You're switching materials and you're trying to remember, oh, I printed that at 210 worked for that material. Once you start doing that, it's easy to make mistakes. You may start a print and then you forget halfway through the print that you forgot to change the material, and you're gonna have a not very nice piece that results of that. So make sure you save your profiles.
And it's also really important to when you're using different types of
Filaments.
No, not filaments, but different brands of filament. They all act differently, and it's really important to get a quality filament because it'll be consistent. Your same settings will work every time for PLA. For example, Hatchbox PLA will work the same when you keep on buying it, but some of the cheaper filaments you get off eBay are inconsistent, and you have to keep on changing your settings, and the prints don't come off the right each time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's a good point. I know Rohit mentioned that earlier. Adaptiiv has spent hours and hours validating filaments and getting those settings for you. So if you buy the Axiom, they're going to provide you with profiles that they have tested rigorously that are known to work and will give you the best quality you can. So Tim's totally right. Picking a good brand of filament and sticking with that filament will help your success rate for sure. One of the other things that's very, very important and will lead to your success is orientation of your bolus. These bolus are the most craziest shapes. That's one awesome thing about 3D printing. It lets you print shapes that you could never do with superflab or wet gauze or wax or other substances. We've done here at IU bolus that have gone up the nasal canal canal, gone around an ear, into the ear, all sorts of different shapes. However, they may be able, their dosimetrists and physics department may be able to design the most awesome bolus you've ever seen, but to actually print that is a whole different story. And just by orientating the bolus on the print bed, one, it can increase your chances of a successful print, but also it can save you a lot of time and material. So in this image here, you can see on the left, if I have the bolus orientated in this way, and I tell the slicer to print that, it's going to generate the support material that it needs to hold that piece that way. You can see all the support here in the light blue color. And if I just take my slicer into my slicer and orientate, turn my bolus 90 degrees, you can see the difference here, how much less support now I'm going to need for that piece. So that's going to, you'd be surprised how little or how much time you can save. You can save half an hour to an hour or more sometimes, depending on the size of your bolus, just by playing with the orientation. So I recommend, putting that in there, turning it, hit your print preview, see how long it's going to take, see how much material it's going to take, and then try a different orientation. Another thing I'd like to point out real quick on the slicing software, these softwares are smart enough to understand where you may have problems. So you can see in the middle picture here, this kind of red area. That is where the slicer will recognize and say, you know what, this is a severe overhang. You may want to put support material here, or you may have a failed print. You can notice over on the left here, that's exactly where the support material was generated. So if I turn my bolus, you see there is no, actually, I know the color makes it seem like the whole thing needs support, but that's just a color thing here. But it did not generate any support in that same area. So just a thing to play with in your orientation before you just hit the print button. You may be able to save yourself a lot of time, and materials is going to help save you money and costs. So I know that was a lot. I know we kind of zoomed through that. We wanted to leave enough time for questions at the end here. But if you can follow some of those basic guidelines, that'll help you get started. Hopefully, that'll lead you down a road to successful prints. Again, this is a lot of trial and error. I would suggest, going onto the internet, getting objects. It doesn't have to be a bolus. Just start practicing printing shapes, different curves, and get familiar with the limitations of your particular printer, your particular build surface, and just getting some experience on having some successful prints. And hopefully down the line, with just a little bit of guidance, you'll be off and running printing successful bolus. One last thing we'd like to mention before we open it up to questions is, here at IU, in our physics team, we sat down together and said, okay, we designed these digitally. Adaptiiv Software does a great job of making this 3D object, and then we 3D print it. But how do we check to make sure that 3D printed object, when it comes off the printer, is exactly what it should be? And Tim kind of alluded to this with the printer QA. Make sure your printer is exactly operating to optimal standards. You want to make sure that bolus is exactly the same thickness as the digital design. One way that we here at IU do that is we usually have the bolus ready for the virtual sim or vSim day, where we actually place it on the patient and then do a cone beam or do an additional CAT scan to check for the fitment. And we also check for the density and the size and shape of the bolus. So you can see in the picture here on this patient where we did this one for a face, you can see how well that the digital or the 3D printed bolus fits as compared to the computer model. You see it's nicely solid, thick, no air gaps in there in the inside of the bolus. But it's kind of going to be up to you and your own center's discretion on how you guys are going to want to do your validation procedure. There's really no set standardization yet on how to do this. It's going to be what your center is comfortable with. We actually place it on the patient, like I mentioned, scan, do a cone beam, and scrutinize those images, and then we actually generate a report that goes into the patient's medical file saying that we verified the thickness of this bolus and it fits and it is like it should. We think this is an important step because we are doing personalized medicine. We take a professional approach to this, and this is used for patients' treatment. So if you can validate and have record of that, that goes a long way to helping satisfy your legal team or your organization's, risk management, to know that you're doing the best possible care and giving the best possible quality. These are just some additional random thoughts, I guess you could call it, just some more tips and tricks. Again, we mentioned this already. Get your printer, start doing some tests, do some calibration files, gain your experience. Stick with one brand of filament for consistency when you're starting out. Get with Adaptiiv. They've validated, like I mentioned, many different kinds of filament. They can recommend certain brands that they've tested that's going to give you the consistency when you're getting started. One important thing too is consider the location. If you're thinking about buying a printer, where you're going to put this printer. Keep in mind, these are not silent machines. They do make noise. It may not be best to set it on your desk next to your telephone when you're trying to print things. Think about who's going to operate this printer. Do you want multiple people operating this printer? Do you want a single person that's kind of your point person to operate these printers? Is that person going to train other people to do it if that person's not there? For example, that's why I have Tim, my lead tech here. If I'm on vacation, Tim can step in and operate the printers, still provide those devices when they're needed. Get with your organization, talk about the regulatory guidelines, if any, that are necessary in your state or your country. Make sure that they're well aware of what you're doing. That, in my experience, has been a big help for us moving forward with our operation here. And lastly, for those of us in the United States where healthcare is for profit, we are going to, be billing these objects as treatment accessories to insurance companies. So you can get with your, department's billing people and talk about the proper CPT coding that you'll be using for these devices and such. So that can go a long way in justifying, the cost for printers and helping you recoup some of that as you get your printing operation started in your department. So let's see, we kind of went through all that really quickly. I apologize. I know that was a really quick overview of a lot of different things, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions. So at this time, if anybody has any questions, we would like to open up the floor to hopefully answer some of those for you guys.
Thanks again, Brian. This is Rohit from Adaptiiv. We've got a few questions that have come in. I know it's at the end of our allotted time, but we do have the luxury of going a little bit over. So, Brian, if you're willing, do you mind answering a few questions here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Let's start. Ahmad has asked a few questions here in the chat, and we want to get to a few of the others. So maybe we'll ask one from Ahmad here. He's asked, what kind of calibration is required to the printer, Brian, and how frequent do you have to calibrate the printer? Is it kind of per model, or like periodically, every week?
Great question. So Ahmad, again, there are no set guidelines for this that I'm aware of. It was kind of what we as our facility felt comfortable with. We felt it was necessary to make sure your printers are calibrated. These are all, the print head is driven by motors and belts that need tightening periodically. They come out of spec. So we print monthly calibration test files. So we'll print a test cube. I do a lot of molds and shells, so I will print test shells and measure with calipers to make sure that my digital design matches what comes off the print bed. If it does not, usually that's indicative of, maybe we need to make sure that the print bed or the print belts are tight, make sure the rails are oiled and lubricated, make sure the printer is clean. You don't want bits and pieces of PLA dropping down into the gearing and things like that. So just try to keep your printer nice and clean, well oiled, make sure everything's tight. After printing for several hours, several hundred hours, for example, you're going to want to check everything, make sure all the nuts and bolts are tight on it, because it does vibrate, it does move. So right now we're pretty comfortable. I know Tim just did the monthly calibration at the beginning of this month. We didn't have to adjust anything. So we think a monthly basis is probably good to start with.
Great, thanks, Brian. So next question here from Robert Yan is if you use a CT scan with 3 millimeter, I believe it's cuts or slices with 3 millimeter slices, is it then necessary to print finer than the 3 millimeters?
That's going to depend a little bit. The only reason I say that because that CT scan is first going to be imported into your treatment planning software, where you're going to be planning off of the resolution of that CT scan. So in other words, you're going to be contouring and creating your bolus structure off of that resolution scan in your TPS. Once your bolus structure is created, like I mentioned earlier, will have the ability to smooth that structure in Adaptiiv Software. So their smoothing algorithm will smooth that surface, so you get rid of those stair stepping. 3 millimeter cuts in radiographic terms, that's a pretty coarse, I would say, quality. Not that that's a bad quality. We do a lot of our CT sims at 3 slicing thickness because we're not really trying to diagnose anything at that point. We are just kind of treatment planning. So, if we get a scan from radiology, for example, they're going to be doing really fine cuts, like 1 millimeter cuts. So you do get a nicer resolution, but you can account for that in the smoothing. But a lot of that's going to depend on the resolution of that object created in your TPS. It's not 100% necessary to print it at lower resolution, although that will help. So hopefully
Great, thanks,
that
Brian. Oh, sorry. Couple other questions. Again, if folks have the time, we'll get to them here. If not, we will follow up with written follow-up and answers to your questions. Sandy Worley asks, and I think it was on one slide where you were talking about the raft, but do you reuse the raft?
Yes, great question. The raft is disposable, and so that raft is going to be a lot like the support. That breaks away from your model. I guess the best way I can describe it, and for those here in the States, when I was a kid, I used to buy plastic models, and they were kind of like all, have these little tiny sprigs of plastic that kind of held it together. You just kind of twist and break those off. The support material should easily break off the main model, the raft included, and that is disposed of. And one last thing I'd like to mention, PLA is actually recyclable. So you can collect all the PLA. You can actually chop it up and recycle it if you want at your local recycling center. So it is I guess it's sort of biocompatible or biosafe. So that's a nice thing. You can collect that and recycle it.
A great point, Brian. Actually, the PLA that we recommend for use with our printer is it's bio-based, it's 100% bio-based, and made by NatureWorks NGO as their product.
That's
and
great.
It's using 100% renewable material. Yeah. All right, let's move on to a couple more questions here. One, I guess, would be maybe for us. It's pretty simple. Heath is asking if there's a particular slicing software with the printer that we recommend. That would be the Airwolf 3D Axiom 20. And Heath, it is the Apex slicing software that actually comes with the printer, as Brian mentioned. So yeah, that's my questions are easy, Brian. I limit them to yes.
That is a very nice slicing software, actually. Like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's built off the Cura slicing engine, which is a very robust and well-known slicing engine out there. This is kind of their flavor of it, and it's a very nice software. You'll have great luck with that.
Perfect. All right. One last question maybe here from Chris. He asks, when the print is finished, he or she, sorry, when the print is finished, do you cut off the support structure with a knife? He's found that, he or she has found that there are often small burrs and things on the surface of the print that are needed to be cut off or melted off with a hot knife. Asking if you see this, if so, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, great question. Yes, that is correct. Sometimes depending on your print, you will have a little bit of, we call it scarring, on the print surface where you may have a little bit of a raised portion where the support didn't come off. You could cut it off with like an X-Acto knife or razor blade or something like that. You just want to be obviously very careful if you're doing that. A lot of times we'll just lightly sand it with some, fine sandpaper, just kind of sand those little rough spots down. You could melt it as well. I typically, that makes me a little bit nervous to start melting the surface, because if you go too much or too far, then you're kind of, then you have like a little dimple in the surface. But yeah, usually just a light buff of some very fine sandpaper or a little X-Acto knife just to kind of get those little pieces off is usually all you need.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, another question here from Mike at Virtual Foundry. Does Adaptiiv plan to develop a software for veterinarians? Unfortunately, right now, no, would be the answer to that. We never say never, but right now, within our own product roadmap, there is no plans to develop a software for veterinarians. Sorry, Mike. All right, and there are a few other questions that we will try to get to. We'll definitely follow up with those folks in writing and email them answers to their questions. Again, really want to say a huge thanks to Brian and Tim today for what has been a great overview of 3D printing. I think it's hard, Brian, you might agree with this, to not get into the weeds a little bit and get very technical and defilled, because it is such an application that requires that level of knowledge. However, I think you did a great job, prefacing 3D printing and I guess making it as easy as possible to understand and provide an overview of the basics. So thanks again to you guys. Thanks to everyone for attending. We really appreciate your time. I know we went over time. I think that just speaks to the amount of quality of material that Brian was presenting. And again, we will be sending a link out to this presentation after the webinar ends, so you will have a copy of this to either show to your teams or rewatch at a future date. So with that, I will wrap up here. Thanks again, Brian and Tim.
Thank you,
Really
everybody.
appreciate it.
Thanks
Cheers.
a lot.